If you're trying to make any kind of meaningful, effective change in your life, you've come to the right place. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Loree Bischoff, and we are about to start talking some shift. I have been itching to get into the subject of manners for a while now. I feel like, especially this year, manners and civility and even some chivalry seem to be lacking. It's really been up for me. So after much searching, and let me tell you, I did a lot of searching to find the perfect person for this subject. I found a lot of people that specialize in, which fork to use at a formal dinner, but I couldn't find somebody that covered a broader area when it came to this subject. So I did. After months of searching, I found the perfect person to get into this with. So let me tell you a little bit about America's trusted etiquette expert, Thomas Farley, aka Mr. Manners. He is a speaker, a workshop leader, a media commentator, writer, and podcaster who is inspiring audiences of all types to master essential communication strategies for success in the workplace as well as in life. So this is not going to be just about workplace people. This is about you and your life and your family and your community. So stay with us here. Mr. Manners' clients have included the United States Department of Commerce, the Estee Lauder Companies, JP Morgan Chase, the Walt Disney Corporation, Bank of America, the American Automobile Association, also known as AAA, the U.S. Army, Viacom, Toyota, and UPS, just to name a few. He is a regular and popular guest on the NBC Today show. His insights appear regularly in other media outlets as well, including Dr. Oz, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Wired and Money magazines, USA Today, CNN, VH1, ABC, and he is on radio stations across the country. Mr. Manners is a very, very busy guy, teaching people everywhere how to mind their manners, personally and professionally. So I'm very grateful to have him with us today. Welcome, Thomas.
Loree, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. And my gosh, I hope you didn't lose your speaking voice after having to do such a long intro with my bio there. But I do
I'm
appreciate
parched.
and I particularly appreciate the nuance that you see in the work that I do. And I do what's known as the Fork course, the dining etiquette program for those who are interested. But for me, what is really exciting about etiquette and manners is the ability to think about etiquette in a completely different way from the no elbows on the table kind of strictures that we often associate with
Yeah.
etiquette. So
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. And so, before I start getting into the particulars of manners in general, I have to ask you, how does one end up being known as, the leading expert on etiquette and Mr. Manners? I mean, I can't imagine as a kid sitting in school, you were sitting around dreaming of how you were going to teach people better manners, right? Like most kids are thinking, I'm going to, launch a rocket into space, or I'm going to be a doctor or a vet. How did you get from there to what you're doing now?
Yes, I think it's funny. My dreams were not really of becoming an astronaut, but of becoming a broadcaster at that time. So in a lot of ways, although I took a detour away from the world of television, it's really been enthralling and such a privilege to have landed with so many media outlets where I get to commentate on a regular basis. But my early upbringing really was filled with wonderful role models, including my parents, school teachers. I had an aunt who is a school teacher in Brooklyn who, boy, if you did not send her a thank you note, a handwritten thank you note within a week of her giving you a birthday present or a holiday gift, you were in deep trouble and you didn't get a present the following year. So
Oh,
from an early age, and in fact, funny little mini story about my Aunt Muriel. So there was one year I just knew that I needed to have proof. So I would not only handwrite my thank you notes, but I would very often Xerox them just in case to have a backstop if anything got lost in the mail. There was one year in particular where she said, Tommy, I never got a thank you note from you. And I said, Aunt Muriel, that there's something wrong here. I wrote you a note. And sure enough, I was able to produce my Xerox evidence,
You
and I
had
handed it to
evidence.
her. Yeah,
That's
and
awesome.
the gifts started flowing once again. So that was really the foundation, though, for me. And I
Okay.
attended Catholic schools when I was younger, in grammar school and high school. So I was very accustomed to wearing a necktie every day to school. So this kind of concept of maybe perhaps a more formal etiquette, as we think of etiquette, were really intrinsic to my childhood and my formative years. It wasn't really, though, until I landed at Town and Country magazine. So rather than broadcasting, I wound up working in magazine publishing, and one of my first jobs was as editor, a senior editor at Town and Country magazine. And one of the columns that I handled there, which I was so privileged to work on, was a column called Social Graces. And it
Mm,
was the magazine's monthly look at the way people interact with one another. And so I know there's probably a perception, perhaps among many of your listeners and viewers, of Town and Country being a magazine for the polo pony set. And,
mm,
if you're not in St. Bart's, you're probably not on the Town and Country reading list, I think is the perception out there. But the reality is, the magazine, as aspirational as it was, in this particular column, really liked to address situations that were everyday scenarios that you could
mm,
relate to no matter what country you lived in, what your economic background might be. So
mhm,
things such as elevator etiquette, or the thing that you wish you had said that you think of 10 minutes after you've left an occasion. So
mhm.
those would be topics. So anything but the elbows on the table,
Yeah.
what do I do if I'm having Queen Elizabeth over for a state dinner at my home? Who sits where? Those sorts of things, frankly, there are guidebooks that exist for that sort of information, that once in a lifetime question you may have. But what really enthralls me and excites me is the ability to address the things that happen to us on a daily, regular basis. And frankly, into your lead in, that really help grease the wheels of interaction in a culture that so often does feel really caustic and inconsiderate with one another. So
Yeah.
that's where it began at Town and Country. And while I was editing that column, we decided the column was so popular. It was the one column that just consistently got letters from our
Hmm.
readers.
Mm.
And the column was popular enough, we decided to create an anthology of the column. And when the book came out, then media started calling, and it was right around then that the Mr. Manners moniker arose, and it stuck. So I feel very honored to wear that crown. It's a weighty responsibility, but
Mhm.
I I take it with great seriousness and pride and fun.
Well, yeah, I'm glad, and I think fun is definitely important. And thank God that you're doing this because honestly, I mean, with all of the advances that humanity has made, I think that like being civil even in the most challenging of situations seems to be something that we still have a lot of work to do. So I'm glad you are out doing the work that you're doing and talking to people and teaching. I think it's really, really important. It's just, you know, interpersonal relationships and communication is just everything stems from that.
Yes.
And this is just like a fundamental thing that is so important, I think, for people and for children to be learning. um, so that brings me to my first question. Do you think that just demonstrating, forget about the really particulars of etiquette, but just basic good manners, do you think that the demonstration of good manners has like diminished and become a little eroded in our society over the past few decades? What's your observation? I feel like it has.
This is such a I love answering this question, as you can imagine, I get it a lot.
Mm,
And certainly the common perception out there is that yes, manners have been on the decline. Uh, each generation typically feels that way about the subsequent generation, and you can actually read texts from the Puritan age where some of the Puritan fathers and mothers are talking about their children in a way that sounds not too dissimilar from a complaint you might hear from a parent in 2020.
mm,
So the reality is, as much as we may think with rose colored glasses that things were just so wonderful and people were really kind and nice, and just, I think movies and TV from the mid 20th century often give us that impression. But the reality is that bad manners, someone who has the mouth of a sailor, there were sailors who had the mouth of a sailor 500 years ago and before
Right.
that.
Right.
We think about even table manners. I mean, the idea that society even use things like a fork. A fork is a relatively modern invention. It was the knife, it was the spoon, and a napkin, having a napkin for yourself. If we were living in the middle or late Middle Ages, your napkin would be a communal, basically like a communal blanket that hung on a wall. And when you felt like you needed to, wipe your gruel off your mouth, you just walked over to the napkin, the hanging blanket, and you wiped it off along with everybody else who was using that same fabric.
Oh,
So,
oh dear.
so in a lot of ways, we're, of course, thank goodness, we're leaps and bounds ahead of that era when it comes to hygiene, when it comes to personal hygiene,
Yeah.
things like, taking a bath, taking a shower, which we're seeing as highly rare things for a person to do. And you
Yeah.
just, you didn't do those things because you had all sorts of superstitions attached to them. So I think manners have improved definitely in those areas. What we have seen for sure, Loree, is over the last 40 to 50 years, we've seen a great amount of casual entering our daily lives. So particularly in the way we dress. And
Mhm.
again, here's where vintage does not do us wrong. If you look at a vintage photo from Times Square in 1950 or 1960, the women are wearing gloves and the men are wearing hats and everyone's in a
Right.
suit. You don't see people wearing saggy basketball shorts and
Yeah.
open lace sneakers and sweatpants, and so there was a
Pajamas.
yes, pajamas, right, exactly. So that
Yeah.
that has changed for sure. We've
Yeah.
gotten a lot more casual, and although there are kind of occasional ebbs and flows in the years since, I
Mhm.
do not think, sadly, that genie is going back in the bottle. And I think this whole, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but this whole pandemic that we've been going through,
Mm.
which has ushered in this concept of don't worry about wearing pants, don't worry about wearing shoes, as long as you look good from basically the torso up, you're fine. Or just being on a call and turning off your camera because you're not camera ready. So I think there's
Yeah.
a casualness, and I think, and this may be my Catholic school upbringing speaking, but there's something about dressing a little bit more either stylishly or formally that I think helps inform and dictate the way we act. The
Mhm.
less formal you're dressed, the less likely you are to feel that you're going to act in a proper way, and that can be a good thing because
Mhm.
people
Mhm.
can relax and be
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
But I
No, I
think
think you're right about that because one kind of your mindset sort of influences what you feel like putting on.
mm,
But then conversely, what you've got on seems to affect your mindset too. So I can
that's right,
see how the two are closely related. Good,
they are.
it's
They are for
interesting
sure.
observation. Yeah. And I imagine that, I mean, culturally and different, I guess, I guess culturally, you're going to see differences too. I mean, I see such a huge difference. I've been to Japan several times, and wow, I mean, talk about a place being extremely manners centric.
Yes.
So, things that you wouldn't even think about here in America, they are over the top, very, very polite and manners, and there's a protocol for things, and that's just culturally how they do things. And then here it's very, very casual, and there's much less of that, just the particulars of it involved. So I guess a lot of it depends on where you're from and your community, your country, your culture as well.
It's true. And I think we know this, of course, there are even regional differences. So,
Mhm.
although, and I live in Manhattan, New Yorkers, I was just having this conversation with someone yesterday who's a non New Yorker who just said, oh gosh, those New Yorkers, they're just so rude. And I know that's the common perception out
Yeah.
there. And I'm continually talking about the kindness of New Yorkers. We,
Yeah.
certainly saw it after September 11th. We see anytime there's a disaster, New Yorkers really come together. We're constantly in a rush. We're constantly overscheduled. So we don't have tons of time. If you need directions, we'll give them to you, but we won't chit chat for 25 minutes after. We're already
Yeah.
we're already on our way to our next meeting.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so I
It's
think
not personal.
regionally, that's right. Don't take it personal. But those of you who are visiting New York or scared to visit New York because you think
Right.
that we're
Yeah.
rude. So
Yeah.
regionally, even within the United States, we see those sorts of etiquette differences.
That's true because I was born and raised in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And we moved to Atlanta when my husband and I, when our children were young, and we lived there for about 8 years. And wow, I was so surprised at the difference in just manners and chivalry there, that I did not know some of these things existed growing up in Minnesota. I didn't see some of the behavior there that I saw in Atlanta, and not that it was terrible by any stretch. There was just a kind of like above and beyond measures that I hadn't been exposed to before, that were very common in the South. And so I thought that was really interesting, and then began the training of my husband.
How's he doing? Is he coming along?
Yeah, he's actually really, really good now. We're still working on the pulling out the chair, like if we go to a restaurant or go to sit and have a cocktail at a bar or something. Yeah, I'm still working on the pull my chair out part before you get yourself all situated. But he's a fast learner, and I think maybe one or two more times he's going to get it. I think he's just so excited to get there and get a beer or a cocktail.
Sure.
He's just like, I'm like, wait, what about me? I'm still trying to get my coat off and get my purse situated. But yeah, he does pretty well. But it was definitely an eye opener when we moved. I'm like, I've been missing out on some stuff here.
Well, and
So
you raise another aspect of this, Loree, which when we
mm,
talk about evolving etiquette and are things better, are they worse, or are they about the same than they were 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago? And I think the the rise of feminism
mhm,
certainly ushered in a difference in the way that men interact with women. And
yeah,
I feel for particularly a certain generation of men, maybe older, who simply just don't know what the right thing
yeah,
is to do. They don't want to offend by not pulling out that chair, but they don't want to offend by pulling out the chair.
yeah.
And it's really a case of knowing your audience, and certainly in the case of a spouse, you should know what the spouse is hoping that you will do for them. But someone else might feel really offended by that and say, I don't need you to pull out my chair. I can do it myself. So
Mhm,
there are a lot of mixed messages out there, and I think that's
mhm,
contributed to some of the falling away of those gentlemanly niceties that
yeah,
that would have been very much a part of our culture only a couple
yeah.
decades ago.
Yeah, I actually kind of feel bad for the guys because it is very confusing, and you don't know, if you're going to offend somebody if you just do something as thoughtful as simply, pull out a chair, or rush ahead to open a door and hold the door. Um, and that's got to be tough. I mean, because when we're talking about chivalry, we're generally assuming we're talking about the behavior of men,
Mhm.
and toward women for the most part, or anyone that is that they're just trying to do, like, take their needs into consideration. uh, and so yeah, I would feel I feel bad for guys because I think that, it's a shame that they would have to actually stop and ask, would you be offended if I pulled open, open the door for you, or pulled out a chair for you? Um, but on the other hand, I guess I can see why some women would. Maybe it's a misinterpretation, because maybe it's not so much about somebody thinking that you're not capable of opening a door or pulling out your chair. It's not about, are you strong enough to do that? Are you just so weak and frail that I have to do this for you? It's really not about that. It's really just about a thoughtful gesture. I feel. Yes. Am I off base on that?
No, no, you're right. I mean, there may be some men who use it as a power role or a power dynamic kind of a situation, but it's fascinating, and we could probably even do a whole show on just this topic. But
Yeah.
so I do, as you mentioned at the outset, I do workshops for corporations in addition to my media work that we've discussed and the keynote speeches that I do around the country. And something that I consistently hear from my executive groups is that many women feel that when a man in the workplace, so this is not a date, this is not a romantic situation, goes to shake their hands, the man will really give a handshake that's very limp and weak. Yeah,
Yeah.
you've obviously experienced it,
I hate
right?
that.
As if like, okay, I'm about to shake hands with a dainty, female here,
Right.
so I can't possibly even show that I'm alive, and it's disrespectful to exert any pressure in the hand. Now, nobody's shaking hands at all right now, but when we go back, and we
Yeah.
will, I'm confident of that.
Yes.
I'm hoping that this was an opportunity for a reset for all of us, because I think although the men think they're doing the right thing,
Hmm.
a woman who then sees that same male then shaking hands with another male, hey, how's it going, John, kind of thing.
Right.
It's like, what is this a bro culture going on? Am I excluded? Am I not capable of? No, that doesn't mean that you should be doing the death grip to anyone.
Right.
But so I'm constantly encouraging again, and it's usually men of a certain generation.
Hmm.
Please, gentlemen in the workplace, you may think this is the right thing to do, but in your honest attempt to be considerate to the women that you're working with,
Right.
remember, they are your equals. They are your equals, and you should not be backing off your handshake so much that
Right.
you're giving them a dainty handshake. It's actually condescending and insulting without that being your intention.
Yeah, I agree. And honestly, to me, it's kind of a disappointment because I really like shaking hands.
Mhm.
And I remember when I was like 21, I was managing the informal dining room at a country club. And one of the clients or guests there, members, was a psychologist. And we were talking one evening, and he introduced himself and went to shake my hand. Now I'm like 21. I've never really had any instruction in handshaking. And so I just kind of I don't know, I just put my hand out there. I don't know what I was doing. And he gave me a lesson in handshaking.
Mhm.
And he said, "Oh, no, dear. This is not how you ever shake hands. This is how you shake hands." And he taught me how to do a handshake. I never forgot it. And it seems, like maybe a small thing, but it is not. It makes a statement. So I never forgot that. And I have a fantastic handshake, if I do say so myself.
Yeah,
And every time I shake hands with a new person, a man usually, they comment on it.
yes.
And so, and if I get one of those kind of limp things,
Mhm.
depending on who it is, I will sometimes say, can we try that again? So,
Yes.
it's kind of I guess, an indirect way of sort of telling them, try a new approach.
One of the fun things I do in my workshops is I actually have a digital measuring device for measuring grip strength.
Ah,
And I pass it around a circle and have people, I tell them, squeeze this gripper with the same amount of strength that you would typically use for a handshake. And what will often happen is, the men in the room typically will squeeze it with all their might just because they're competing with one another to who can see
yeah.
get the highest number. But
Surprise, surprise.
yes, but those who are approaching the exercise seriously and with an open mind, it's fascinating to see the differing perceptions of what amount of pressure and strength is appropriate and what's not. And this, we talked about the cultural differences. This varies greatly. I do a lot of work with overseas companies, and so companies from Germany or East Asia, and handshake grip strength varies radically. So what we know as a good American handshake or good North American handshake would be seen either aggressive, for example, in Japan, if in fact you were
Mhm,
shaking
mhm.
hands with someone from Japan,
Right,
although they typically bow with one another.
right. They're bowing.
Yes. Or, but conversely, for a German or for someone who's from Russia, their handshakes are extremely strong. And when you
Mhm.
first shake hands with someone from one of those countries, very typically you're thinking, oh my goodness, what did I do wrong? I mean, it's just so unanticipated when you're not
Yeah,
expecting it.
yeah.
So I advise them, if they're doing business with Americans, that they need to dial it back. I advise the Americans anticipate a really
Mhm.
strong H,
Right,
dial it up.
right.
So anyway, all the little nuances that we encounter, and that's what makes etiquette so much fun.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. So, okay, what do you think? Last question around chivalry in particular. What do you think should be just like a safe bet? What do you think is safe, without being in danger of what can a guy do that would be, just a polite thing without having to worry about that?
Sure. Yeah. So what I advise is for someone who wants to cultivate a genuine reputation as someone who is a gentleman, you hold the door for everyone, men, women, cats, dogs, squirrels.
Yeah.
In that way, someone may still feel, no, you go ahead, I can hold my own door. But if you're doing that universally for every living creature, you can't possibly be accused of favoritism, or that you're being condescending to a certain gender simply
Yeah.
because you think they're weaker. I think if you do it consistently and you do it not in a showy way, but in an authentic way, then I think you're really on a great footing. And gosh,
Mhm.
who doesn't love that person who always says, "Oh no, after you. Oh please go ahead. Oh no, you
Right.
take the last peg in a blanket," right? As opposed to the
Right.
the wolf who's just scarfing it down and pushing to get in the front of the line, and nobody wants to be
Yeah.
around that person. So I think
Right.
that's really my best advice.
That's good advice. That's good. You really can't go wrong when you are just being very polite and trying to just do nice things for everyone.
Yes,
Good,
exactly.
good call. All right, let's talk about manners between couples.
Mm.
If you're in a relationship with someone, you're married, you're living in the same under the same roof. I know that my own observation, shockingly, I've seen that basic manners just between couples, um, they seem to mysteriously dissipate over time, which I think is a terrible habit to allow, in a pattern to allow to take hold. So I want your take on that. And then when do you think it's okay to sort of relax your manners or your decorum? And then what should you never compromise on when it comes
Mm.
to that?
Yeah, all great questions. Well, it's funny. I used at Town and Country, I worked with a woman who was our health and beauty editor, and she was just a brilliant writer and such a good friend. Janet Carlson was her name. And she, later in life, re embraced her love of competitive dancing. And so she wrote this book all about how dancing saved her life as she was going through a difficult time in her marriage. And one of the stories that she recounts in this book is how she would commute from suburban Westchester down into New York City every day with her husband, and they would sit side by side in the train. And her husband, especially in the winter, would get the sniffles. And he would just kind of sit there on the train and he'd, be sniffing away and sniffing away. And in the early years of their courtship and of their marriage, she would kind of just gingerly reach into her purse and she'd lovingly hand him a tissue to dab his nose because he never had tissues with him. And that at a certain point in the marriage, suddenly this sniffling became so annoying, and it was the loving gesture of care and compassion was gone. And
Mhm.
she knew that that was one of the flashpoints where she knew that the marriage probably was not long for this world, and in fact they did split up, and she writes about all of this in her book. So I think certainly when we're dating, there is a desire to put the best possible version of ourselves forward, which is probably not necessarily who we are on a day-to-day basis with our
Yeah.
family or friends.
Right.
So what people are seeing of us in those early stages is somewhat skewed. And then I think conversely, whatever person that we're courting or dating is perhaps, hopefully, so smitten that they're either not seeing a lot of our flaws that are there, or they're overlooking them and we see them as adorable foibles rather than annoying
Yeah.
habits.
Yeah.
And I think, and I'm not married, but as time goes by, I do think that unless you're a really super patient, understanding, kind person who never is stressed out or anxious, there are going to be moments where what was sweet and cute at first just isn't anymore. And I
Mhm.
think people get a little bit too ingrained in their lazier ways of existing, and kids now are in the picture, and
Mhm.
you don't get to put on makeup in the morning like you would use to, before your husband wakes up in bed and you wake up all refreshed with your makeup on, looking like just
Yeah,
came out of the
yeah.
salon after
Have you been
2 hours.
watching The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel?
Uh-huh. Yes, yes. Isn't that,
She wakes up before he does, puts on all of her
yes,
makeup, and then crawls back into bed.
exactly.
But women used to do that.
It's remarkable. But
Yeah.
gosh, fair play to anybody who does that. I give them a lot of credit. But
Whew.
I wonder sometimes whether it's even appreciated by the husbands, who probably don't even notice half the time.
Right. It's a lot of effort and lost sleep,
Yes.
but yeah, and I think though, I feel like I think that there are certain things that you should never compromise on. I've been married for over 36 years,
Congratulations.
and thank you. And we have a fantastic relationship, a wonderful marriage, and but yeah, you notice that, I mean, we've been together for a long time, almost 40 years. So, you kind of I'm very observant about things like that. And I observe other people's relationships and how they are within their, with their significant other or their spouse. And one of the things that I notice is the people that don't stay together, or that do stay together but they're miserable. There is there's very little sense of kindness, thoughtfulness, and just general manners anymore,
Yeah.
which is sad, because I feel like you it's a demonstration that you no longer place that person in high regard, high enough regard to, comport yourself with some semblance of thoughtfulness and kindness and civility. And I think that you should never, like, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, you never swear at your partner. Like,
Mhm.
and I don't mean swearing in general, like
Right.
sailor mouth you were talking about. I mean calling them a name that
Hmm.
way. You don't
Hmm.
call your partner names. I don't care how horrible they've been or what they've done. I just think that's a line you should never cross. What do you think?
I would agree with you on that. And I think even just taking it one step further, embarrassing your spouse or
Mm,
significant other in front of others. So where you're
yeah,
actually criticizing something, that rather than waiting until you get home or waiting until the moment is over, I think that is one of the
yeah,
most horrifying things anyone can do. If you have that sort of relationship where there's just constant good-natured ribbing that you can do in front of your friends and nobody
yeah,
takes any offense, but where you're
yeah,
deliberately doing it to embarrass,
yeah.
uh, or belittle, I think
Hmm.
that's it's an appalling way to behave, and it shows such little respect. So, and
Yeah.
and I fully agree. You should not be calling your spouse a name if something's really irking you that much. Clearly, it's time for a conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really good point, because I totally agree with that too. You never try to elevate yourself or get a laugh at the expense of your partner. And there is a fine line between good-natured teasing
Hmm.
and being able to have some fun,
Yes.
and actually humiliating somebody. And yeah, those two are like my top two. You never do that. It's such a breach of trust and a betrayal. I just think, yeah, doing those things, you're definitely it's going to leave a mark. Let's just say.
Yeah, and I think that kind of mean-spiritedness is, I believe when we, talked again at the outset about our manners on the decline, and I do think that there's a certain mean-spiritedness that's entered our way of being, it's entered our
Hmm.
lexicon, and I think a big part of that has been social media and technology, and it's so much easier to be a mean, awful,
Yeah.
complaining person or critical person when you can do it offline, when you can do it in an email, when you can do it in a tweet, when you can do it in a Facebook post, as opposed to having to literally stand in someone's presence and look them in the eye and say those same vile, awful things. Now, there are people who can do that too, but I think asynchronous communications, as it is called, where we're not live, where the person can respond to us right there, right then and there, I think it makes it far easier for people to simply hide behind the
Hmm.
wall of a screen, behind the wall of a tweet. And that's something that's a relatively modern development. Prior to email and social media, we had
Hmm.
telephones, yes. We had the telegraph, maybe would be the closest thing. But, unless you were really going to sit down with your quill pen and write a long, beautifully written, mean letter, you probably didn't have any means to be able to do this in such a
Right.
divisive and critical way.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. A lot of great things with social media, but also the flip side, when you're in the safety and comfort of, of your own home, or you've got the anonymity working on your side. You don't really need any, courage. Then you can just be an ass. Because there's nobody in your face calling you out, and having that you have to have a actual adult conversation with.
That's
It's
right. Exactly.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so what let's talk a little bit about what's going on right now. So everybody's cooped up at home. We've got kids. Yeah, everyone's spending a lot more time together than they probably have in a long time. What manners and habits do you think might be like extra important for people to be mindful of during this time when you just can't get out that much, and you don't have 8 hours or 10 hours a day away from each other?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I will just start off by saying I myself also have a podcast. It's called What Matters Most, and I just a couple of months ago finished my first season. We're working on season 2 right now. When my producer and I were putting the pieces together for the first season, I had all of these terrific episodes in the can because it was my goal to have a full season populated before I announced that there was a podcast out there. Well,
Okay.
some of the episodes, just to give you a sense, that I had ready on the go, one was on air travel etiquette from the standpoint of a flight attendant. And, this interview was
Mm,
done in January, so we didn't speak at all about COVID. Nobody really, I mean, some
yeah,
people knew, but it wasn't even a blip on most people's radar.
right.
Um, I did another one with a Broadway star, an opera singer, on the etiquette that a performer wishes that the audiences would know from the perspective
Oh,
of a performer, which is a
mm-hmm.
fascinating conversation. But
Mm,
yeah, as I said, I live in New York. We don't know when Broadway will even be back, let alone
yeah,
to be putting that episode out there in March. So as a consequence, we threw the baby out with the bathwater and started from scratch and made the podcast all about pandemic etiquette. And
mm,
in the time since, I launched a syndicated national column on questions of COVID etiquette. And of course, I've been doing a lot of media with all these questions. And it's been so fascinating for me. And I think it's a perfect example of the way etiquette can truly evolve and adapt to situations. So
yeah.
there's, again, this perception that, etiquette is something that your great 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 grandma was important to her, and she's got 17 sets of silverware depending on what the occasion is, and that's etiquette. And yet true etiquette is malleable, and it's malleable, and it needs to exist because it gives people a roadmap. It gives people a playbook for how to act when they're in an unfamiliar situation, whatever that situation might be. So maybe you're 14 years old and you're going to your first wedding,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't know, well, what side am I supposed to sit on if I'm in a church, or what am I supposed to wear? So there's etiquette for those things, so that no one feels silly or that they did the wrong thing or did something different from everyone else. And I think now, in the time of this pandemic, we are, all of us, none of us were alive going through the 1918 1919 pandemic, so we're all dealing with something that's completely radically different.
Mm-hmm.
And the concept that we're wearing masks and that we're distancing, and all of these things are brand new to us. So it's been a fascinating period for me.
Yeah.
And when it comes to peace in the home, which you're asking about, I think it's vital. That's where it starts. My gosh, if we can't be civilized to the members of our own household, how can we possibly be expected to be at our best selves in school, when we're Zooming, and work calls when we're Microsoft Teamsing? It's vital.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, manners and consideration, you're all underfoot perhaps, and that's evolving a little bit, and kids are slowly kind of going back to school and hybrid models, and some offices are opening up. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
where we were several months ago, but still you have many households where you've got a lot of, or in New York where I am, you might have a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, and you've got 3 or 4
Mm.
household members all there underfoot all the time. So yes,
Yeah.
patience and consideration.
Yeah, yeah, wow, that just, like, gave me anxiety. 'Cause that's a lot under one roof for a long period of time, and certainly, it would be probably very trying to keep yourself, in that place of being thoughtful and composed and, you know, good natured all of the time. But I think, yeah, doing your best though, to even with your family members, because like you said, it all starts at home. And just doing the simple things that you don't feel are really necessary to do it anymore, but simple pleases and thank yous and excuse me and can I get you something, or how can I help? I mean, just the simplest things like that. That doesn't take any effort. That's just habits, and they're good habits, and they mean so much to the person that is receiving, those initiatives. And then you're demonstrating that for your kids. So let's talk about that for a minute. Teaching kids manners. Do you think that, couple things? One, do you think that, not everybody, but generally, do you think that parents are slacking on teaching some basic general manners with kids? Um, I don't know. My kids have been out of school now for a long time, so I'm not seeing that kind of. I'm not familiar with that environment firsthand anymore. And of course, the stuff that you see out on YouTube and social media usually just shows the worst of things and not the best. So you can get a warped view of things. But I wonder what your take is on that. And then I also wonder about, do you think that like kids, young people, their TV shows and the movies, do you think that influences an attitude of irreverence in kids? Because you see a lot of that kind of, irreverent, snarky humor, even geared toward young kids, in the movies and their cartoons and TV shows. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. How much of an influence is that on their, ability to be just respectful and use some manners?
Yes, I think there's no question that children grow up a lot faster today than they ever did before. They're exposed to things, I mean, whether it's sex education or music lyrics, they are seeing things,
Yeah.
they are hearing things that were simply not accessible to them before. So they're growing up a lot faster. I think a lot of the role models in mass media can, and in politics, unfortunately, can provide an example that shows that it's okay to talk a certain way, or it's okay to be a bully, or it's okay to be selfish. And so, frankly, it really is vital now more so than ever for parents to provide that proper foundation. And I'm not talking about having your children, leave it to Beaver style, coming to the dinner table at 5:15 with their bow ties perfectly
Right.
straight and yes ma'am and yes sir kind of thing. Again, I don't know that it existed in some quarters, but I don't think it really reflected the reality of
Hmm.
Americana in the 1950s, although
Yeah.
it's easy to think that way when you watch these shows. But I do think that there is a vital role that the parents play that has been abdicated somewhat by the fact that most American households who have children by necessity or by choice are double income households where
Mhm.
both parents are working. And so the kids are probably more influenced by their friends who they're seeing either on social media when they get home from school or on sports teams and who they're interacting with there on buses and so on. And their interactions with their parents are fairly minimal. Again, talking pre-pandemic times. One
Mhm.
of the really nice things I think about this pandemic, and I'm constantly on the lookout for silver linings, as I know you are, is that parents and families have really had a chance to free from the distractions of, mom or dad going off to work, freed from the distractions of, okay, well, I got to pick this one up from lacrosse at 2, and this one up from football at 4, and this one up from band practice at 6. And, we had a long, long, long season, and for some, it's still continuing, where those things weren't happening and everybody was underfoot. And families were eating together, families were cooking together, families were clearing the table together. So for all of the things that children today have been deprived of, graduations and proms, and that's really sad for the teenagers and the young people of the world, frankly.
Mhm.
I think this really is parents have a wonderful, unique opportunity to use this time to instill some of those good manners. Because if somebody gets to the age of 30 and they were not exposed to any of this, chances are they're going to be pretty set in their ways. But it's those children who at age 6, like me, who were writing their thank you notes to their Aunt Muriel and to my parents and whomever else,
Yeah.
uh, who still do it to this day. Or at least if they don't always do it, they know that they should be doing it. So I think yes, I think children today do need to embrace this opportunity to learn from their parents, and the parents need to take on that leadership role. I
Hmm.
think a big part of the challenge, in addition to the double income and the two-parent working scenario, is that I think starting around the 1960s, those parents, the baby boomers, they didn't want to be thought of as sir or ma'am or Uncle John, or no, just call me John. And so there was kind of a melting away of, don't call me grandma. I'm not a grandma. I'm doing spin classes. How dare you call me grandma? Grandson. Um,
Right.
and I
Right.
think as some of that formality and some of that distinction, that familiar distinction, has melted away, can we blame kids for thinking that they can talk to their elders in the same exact way that they talk to their friends? Or even, I think of the friends of my parents when I was growing up. I would not in a million years ever call them by their first name. It wouldn't even,
Hmm.
I knew what their first names were because I would hear my parents say those first names, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't use their first names. Now, what do you do if you're a parent who's raising your child to call an adult Mr. So and so, or Mrs. So and so, or Miss So and so, or Ms. So and so, and
Hmm.
that Ms. So and so says, call me Susie to the child? Now the
Right.
child's really got a little bit of a dilemma. So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
all of these are factors in why children are perhaps not as mannerly sometimes as we would like them to be, and why
Hmm.
parents are not always putting in the time or the thought into it that perhaps they should.
Right. Yeah. Good points. And y- and also, this is such a great opportunity right now. I mean, for all of the terrible circumstances around this situation, there are some windows of opportunity for people. And that is one of them. If you have kids that are home with you and now you're spending 24/7 together, this is your time, right? To sit down and go, you know what? We're gonna implement some new habits here. What
Yes,
a great opportunity. I mean, you've got nothing but time and you've got a captive audience, right?
yes. It's so true. And I would say for any of your listeners or viewers who are tuning in thinking, well, gosh, doesn't that just sound nice, Loree and Thomas? You come to my house sometime and see what I'm dealing with. I will
Mm,
tell you, and I've actually, even though table manners and table settings are not really my focus, I'm very often asked, and I'm brought in by parents who would say, could you do an etiquette dinner with my family,
mhm,
with
mhm.
my children? And children love
They
learning
love
new
it.
skills, especially when they
Yeah.
can prove to their peers and to their elders that they've learned something that other people don't necessarily know. It's very empowering. So they
Yes.
may not always want to hear it from mom and dad,
Right.
but if there's some role model in their lives that you can not employ, but
Mhm,
that you can
mhm.
task to help out with the teaching of some of those manners, if they're simply not going to listen to mom or dad, you might be surprised at how open to the idea that they are.
Yeah, I have read a few stories on that same note before, where a family had decided to help their kids while they're stuck home in the COVID crisis, learn how being a guest and running a restaurant could work.
Mhm.
So they like traded roles, which was so cool. So that the kids were like the maitre d and the waiter, serving the parents, and then switching it around. And so, what a fun opportunity. And I know that you're absolutely right. Bringing your kids into the fold and helping them be, rather than like, we're going to teach you, it's more like, hey, we're all going to do this fun project together and we're going to learn together, and bringing them into it so that they are part of it and they're learning and then they're contributing. That makes them feel awesome. And it's fun. It's
Yes,
really fun. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. And by the way, before I forget, I will have you know, Mr. Manners, that I sent all of my guests a handwritten thank you note. And I don't want you to think when you get one from me that it's just because we had this conversation. You can ask any of my past guests, they've all received one. So just saying.
A+ to you. I applaud you. And yes, I know that you would not just be doing it for appearances. I believe that it's who you are. It radiates
Yeah.
in the
Thank
conversation,
you.
clearly.
I had to throw that out there just so you didn't think, uh-huh. All right. So, hey, do you have a going rogue story for me?
It's so apropos that you bring that up in this moment, because I was just thinking that this is perhaps the perfect segue for my going rogue moment. So
Awesome.
thank you for teeing me up. And I love the phraseology around that. I think it's a great, really learning opportunity, and an idea
Yeah.
of being a rogue,
Right.
kind of little rough and tumble, doing something out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
So I was fresh out of college, and I went on a job interview for a magazine position that I was probably underqualified for, but as a brash, I was 20. As a brash 20-year-old, I really felt very certain about my abilities to take it on, and went in for this interview with a publisher, a European publisher who was doing interviews in New York. And I thought the interview had gone particularly well, although there was one question that really tripped me up in this interview. And the question was whether I thought of myself as a go getter. And I don't know
Hmm.
why. I didn't expect it. I didn't see it coming. And I felt in retrospect that my response was a little bit weak for someone who truly was a go-getter.
Hmm.
You would have embraced it fully and not hesitated a moment. And I felt like I waffled a little bit in my reply. So I had just read a book. I read this book that said, if you, whether you get a job or not, always send a thank you note. So there's their nice segue. But that if you don't get the job, that you should tell the individual that you think they made a mistake. And again, for a brash 20-year-old, I thought, wow, that seems gutsy to tell this person who's more than twice my age that I think he made a mistake. And so as it turned out, I didn't get the job. And he did send me a very nice note, thank you for applying, and we were very impressed with you, but we've decided to go a different direction. So I wrote right back, and I said, I think you've made a mistake, and here's why. And I went through a list of all the reasons why I thought I could ace this job and I could do a wonderful, wonderful job based on the vision that he had outlined for this launch magazine that he was creating. And my final line was of this letter, which seared in my mind. I said, during our interview, you asked whether I consider myself a go-getter. I think you have your answer. And then I signed it, and I licked the envelope, put a stamp on it, stuck it in the mail. 2 weeks later, he wound up calling me, and I'll never forget his line. He said, he was European, so he said, are you still in play? And I said,
Wow.
yes, I am still in play. So I went back in for interview number 2, and he wound up hiring me. He had hired someone else. It hadn't worked out so well. He was having second thoughts. He got my letter, and he
Mm.
wound up. And so now, years later, I never knew who that person was. Years later, I wound up meeting the person who had actually gotten the position. He knew
Really?
all about who I was, but I had no idea who she was. And so we had a good conversation. It was long after I'd left that particular publication, but we kind of compared notes. But that
Yeah.
was my rogue moment, saying that I thought that this
Mhm, mhm.
particular magazine publisher had made a big mistake by not hiring
Right.
me.
Wow, that's a good one because yeah, that would take, I think, some real trust and some nerve to do that. Like you said, I mean, somebody that's, maybe a couple decades older and obviously they're like running the show, you're trying to get a job from them and to say, I think you've made a mistake. That takes some nerve.
Yes. I guess at the time, and this really was the point, I wish I could remember the name of the book that had this advice, but at that
Mm,
point, you haven't gotten the position already. You've lost it.
yeah,
So what do you have to lose, right? All they can do
right,
is say, well, boy, that person's got a nice opinion of themselves. But apart from that, nothing
right.
ventured, nothing gained.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point, and that's one of the things I love about people sharing their going rogue stories because there's always that thing, yeah, but if I don't, what's the worst can happen or that can happen or what do I have to lose? And when you really ask yourself those questions, and you can feel comfortable with your answer, it makes it a lot easier for you to take that risk and do what maybe for the individual is make a rogue move and go rogue by their own definition.
Yes.
So it's always fun to hear everybody's stories and the value that comes of it. Thank you for sharing that. It's
Thank you
really,
for asking. I haven't talked about it in a while, so it's nice to reflect on it.
yeah, that's a really good one. If you think of the name of that book, I'm super curious. Please send
Sure.
it to me.
I will. I will.
Well, you know what? I think that we have shared some amazing information today. I love everything that you talked about. I think that it's super important for people to take this information very seriously, and not only for your own relationships with the people around you, but just I think it just makes you feel good about yourself when you're being a thoughtful, kind person that demonstrates some just fundamental manners. It matters. Manners matter, right?
They do, and that's the name of my podcast, What
Right.
Matters Most. Yeah,
Yeah.
when I encounter someone who's, and I do hear this a lot, oh, why send a thank you note? Why is it? And I will typically say, you can look at this from strictly a self-preservation, selfish perspective. And the fact is, people who have good manners, people who are thoughtful and considerate, they're the ones who get put on the flight when the flight was full and they have one seat left. They are the ones who grandma remembers the next year because she's got your thank you note magnetized to her refrigerator, as opposed to your cousin who maybe sent a text, in text shorthand, thanks granny, and that
Right.
was the extent of it. So even if you are doing it, and I hope you're not you, but anyone is doing
Yeah.
good etiquette, performing good etiquette simply for selfish reasons, there's a definitely a
Mm-hmm.
benefit to
Mm-hmm.
being mannerly. Hopefully it just becomes a part of who you are, and that's not the reason you're doing it, but you're going to get the job, you're going to get the promotion, you're going to get the relationship, you're going to get along with people, are going to like you, and you're going to like them more the more
Mm-hmm.
you can grease the wheels of those social interactions through good etiquette and manners.
Yeah, I agree. And you know what? It just makes people feel good. And I just don't, there's just not a better feeling than when something you've said or done, even the smallest thing, lights somebody else up and it makes them feel good. That's like the best feeling in the world. So it's almost even a self-serving thing.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I totally agree.
Yeah. So, Mr. Manners, why don't you tell everyone where they can find out more about you and your services and your podcast?
Thank you. Thank you for that opportunity. So yes, the podcast, as I mentioned, we're just about to go into season 2. It's available in all the wonderful places where you might find your podcast: Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and so on, Google Podcasts. And it is called What Matters Most. And in our season 1, which is up there for listening, we talked with everyone from relationship experts to travel experts to people in the world of sports about what these sea changes in our lives over the last 8 months have meant to the way we interact with one another and how we can do so more considerately. So that's the podcast, and I'd love to count your listeners as my listeners as well, and I have to have
Yes.
you on my show as we kick off season 2.
I
So
would be
that's
honored. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not doing a video as you do here. I think it's
Mhm.
a wonderful addition. It's something I've been considering, but
Mhm.
still just tweaking the mix of the show before we take that next platform step. So that's the
Yeah.
podcast. And then on social media, I'm Mr. Manners on Twitter and Instagram. And that's Mr. spelled out, Mister. And the website is Mr. also spelled out -manners.com. And that's where you can find out information on all of the workshops that I offer. So for anyone who works in human resources or sales, people tend to hear Mr. Manners and they think, oh, well, that's nice. Again, he's teaching people how to eat soup properly. The reality is, I do programs on dealing with difficult people and customer service. And now, for this era that we're living through, I'm doing programming that I never envisioned doing, but I feel is vital. So things like being your best virtual self, or for sales teams, how do you connect with your customers in an age where you can't call on them
Yeah.
in the traditional way of going out for a steak dinner somewhere? Now you're all distancing and nobody's getting on an airplane. So how do you still
Mhm.
connect with your customers? How do you connect with your team in a way that's meaningful and relevant in this new
Mhm.
age, which seems like it will be with us for the foreseeable? So those are
Yeah.
all ways that people can engage with me, and I look forward to hearing from. And I also love getting questions. So if any of your listeners have questions, something that's going on in their household or their office, I love hearing those as well.
Perfect. That's awesome. And we will, of course, include your contact info in the show notes, so people will be able to find that. You know what? I think that we have given everyone a lot of really great shift to think about today. And so with that, I am going to let you go. And again, thank you so much for spending all this time with us today. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you listeners and viewers for hanging out with me and Thomas today. If you would like some guidance, shifting your mindset or up-leveling your health, getting unstuck, just head on over to LoreeBischoff.com and you can find out what private coaching with me is all about. If you find value in everything that you hear on We're Talking Shift, please do us a solid and give us a rating and a review. Leave some comments because we really like to hear what you think about the show. Tell us your greatest takeaway. And make sure that you share all of this great shift with your friends. Don't keep it all to yourselves. Until next week, stay feisty, my friends. Mind your manners and go make some epic shift happen in your lives. That means you too, Gary B.